It's a great pleasure to be here. It's an interesting moment in the life of the Catholic Church, and I really welcome the opportunity to talk about the issue of the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church on college campuses. Because, as I said last night to the students of the Newman community, it's one of the healthy places where some solutions can come from, much more than from the institutional church, and even more than from academic theologians. So students, young people, the campus in general is one place to start a new reflection and a new action, because that is what happened to me. I am a church historian working in history of theology, and for many years I wasn't really interested in the issue of the sex abuse crisis. And what happened in 2018, which is a major watershed in the history of the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, changed something in my interest, but also in, if I can use this term, in my heart, because I found that not enough was coming from the Catholic intellectual community. So what has happened in these last couple of years to me is that I started working more on this issue in articles for the general public and articles for specialists, and in the semester of the spring 2019 at Villanova with an undergraduate course on the history and theology of the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, which has been really a transformative experience for me. So one of the products of this reflection that came after following all the major events, bishops being accused for the first time, not just of failure in overseeing what was happening, but also of being sexually abused themselves. A cardinal who is sitting in an Australian jail after his conviction for sexual abuse himself. So after observing all these events, the responses of the Vatican and so on, the effects of the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church in the United States, which is a separate and special case that we should talk about that as slightly different from what happened globally, I thought it was time to take a look at the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church from a theological point of view. So the first reason to start writing on the abuse crisis as a Catholic theologian, as a Catholic scholar, as a Catholic, was that I felt the misleading, self-serving, and ideological to frame the abuse crisis first as a clergy abuse crisis, because my conviction is that this is a Catholic abuse crisis, not just a clerical abuse crisis. We are discovering in many countries the second or third page of this crisis, which is the history of abuses that happened in communities that were run not by clergy, but by women religious and by lay people. And so far the focus has been on the clergy, and that has been used in many different ways, but that is just one aspect of the crisis, which is it's undeniable, but it's not the whole picture. And second was the idea to move on from the idea that this crisis can be solved only with a law and order approach, with the criminal justice approach, which is what we have seen so far, especially in this country, mostly because of the frustration of the limits of that. Because if you have read the John Jay report that was published a few years ago. The report that was commissioned by the U.S. bishops to the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, because bishops understood that that was a public health crisis. And the John Jay report accepted because it's a public health crisis. We know that only 3% of all priests that were credibly accused have served time in jail. Only 3%. So that is a real problem. The problem is that there is no way, in my opinion, to find a solution to the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, limiting ourselves to the criminal justice aspect. So there are causes of this crisis, and there are effects of this crisis on the Church that we need to consider. And so what I wrote and published last month in the Jesuit-run journal Theological Studies is a brief introduction to the map of issues, or one possible map of issues that the abuse crisis raises in terms of topics, of themes, of texts that we should look at in a different way, knowing what happened with the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church first. So what are a few possible problems in the Church's reading of Scripture, of the fathers of the Church, of the law, first. And second, what we should consider when we think about how this generation or the next generation of Catholics and of scholars will read Scripture, the fathers of the Church, the tradition, and so on, in light of the abuse crisis. This is something that cannot be outsourced to lawyers, to judges, to journalists. So there is a theological work that needs to be done. If this is also a health crisis, it's a crisis that cannot be solved by undertakers only. But the doctors, biologists, scientists should be called into this. And so far, in my opinion, the theological community globally, but also in the United States, has been reluctant to do that. And I am part of the problem, because I started hearing about this crisis in the early 2000s. I was too young to be aware of that, of the first wave of the crisis in the mid-1980s, but by the early mid-2000s, it was clear what had been discovered, and I waited more than a decade to start working at that. Maybe because my children just started to go to a Catholic school. Many factors. Okay, so I'm not accusing anyone, if not myself, of having been slow in doing this. So here there are a few issues that I believe are very important, and I'll give you just a brief sketch. This article is a 9,000-word article, Theological Studies. So if you're interested, just let me know, and I can share the article with you. So first, the sex abuse crisis is also a crisis in the conscience of the Church in terms of what happened in the last 50, 60 years. Because what we know of the abuse crisis shatters both narratives within Catholicism, both the progressive narrative, which says, finally, after Vatican II, we discovered the gospel and we became the church, or a better church. And we know that Vatican II didn't really have an effect in stopping the sex abuse crisis. But it also shatters a certain conservative Catholic assumption on the church, which is that the church had been preserved from the ills of modernity, of sexual immorality of the 60s, because the sex abuse crisis is once again one of the evidences that the church and the world, and world means society, means culture, means state, government, the economy, what in Latin can be called the ad extra. So there is no wall of separation. And so the Catholic Church has been really part of a wider phenomenon of sexual exploitation, of sexual abuse. And so the idea, a certain conservative Catholic ecclesiology, the church is an island of grace that is isolated from the world, it doesn't hold water. So this crisis has really put into question what happened, also because there is a technical problem that we don't know if it's possible to write a history of the abuse crisis that goes before more or less the year 1950. We don't know if that documentation is available, if it hasn't been destroyed, if there's someone who can manage that mass of paper. We know that the Catholic Church, until recently, and it's not quite clear so where things stand now, had a policy of burning problematic dossiers of clergy accused of sexual abuse every 10 years. And so we know that for a long time those papers were kept for high-profile cases in the Vatican, in the famous Inquisition or Holy Office, and until the early 20th century, we have records of fires of those documents. So we don't know if we will ever be able to write a history of the abuse crisis, which tells us also that this phenomenon of the sexual abuse in the church is first a phenomenon that is everywhere. And so that missing piece of history of the Catholic Church's dealing with that is just one little piece in the bigger puzzle of the history of sexual abuse in human history. Because every time national commissions have investigated the Catholic Church together with non-Catholic churches, with Boy Scouts, Jewish schools, and so on, they have found very similar patterns. And so here the Catholic Church is the most investigated institution. For sure, it's not the only one where this happened. So that has to be very clear. So we don't know what we don't know. And we don't know if we will ever be able to know the history of the sex abuse crisis. This is important for Catholicism because in the Catholic Church, there's a very strong sense of the tradition, the Catholic tradition, but there's no tradition possible without a certain sense of history. And so history is one thing, and tradition is slightly different, but it's very hard to build a tradition, which means to learn from our history without a history. That, as a historian, I see that as a really, really serious problem. So that is, and historiographically, this is a huge problem, especially for the Catholic Church in the United States, because it has tended in these last few years, especially in the US, to reopen the question of the 60s. What happened in the 60s? So here, this phenomenon of the abuse crisis is part of the larger picture of two completely separate narratives within our contemporary societies, especially in the United States, about what happened in the 60s. Was that the decade of the Second Vatican Council, of the Civil Rights Movement, of the anti-Vietnam War, and so on, or was it the decade of Woodstock, of pot smoking, and all the rest? Or is something more complicated? So we have two separate narratives, and what has happened in the Catholic Church in the last couple of years, especially, is a total absence of nuance. Either you have a certain narrative on the 60s, and you have a certain denial about what the abuse crisis means for the church, or you are exactly on the other side, and you have another kind of denial on what went wrong in the 60s and after the 60s. And so history is one big problem. Second, there's a problem of how to read through Scripture and the fathers of the church, the first few centuries. So here, there's one problem, I believe, that a certain competition within the Catholic intellectual arena in these last few years has coalesced around this question. Do we want to be a modernized Catholicism, or do we want to stick with the early centuries? In that period between Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, more or less. Now, the problem is that if you look at those sources of the tradition between Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, it's something that really doesn't help you understand theologically what happened with the sex abuse crisis. So here, a certain culture of theological ressourcement, a French word that means renewing things by looking back at something that has been overlooked for centuries, it's a limited resource because there are problems and issues that cannot be solved by looking at those theologians, all male, and almost all of them without families, without a wife, without children, that have nothing to say about that. That shows the limits of a certain anti-modern Catholic way to deal with change. Or if not anti-modern, skeptical of modernity. Now, if there's something that has helped us discover and deal with this sex abuse crisis, is the culture of modernity. A sort of culture of suspicion, of transparency, of inquiry, of the rejection of clericalism. So here, it's much bigger than bad clergy, good lady. That's a problem. But there's also an intellectual problem in where to look in the Catholic theological tradition when we want to see how that problem was dealt with early on. And early Christians have a fairly accurate idea that there is a problem with the sexual exploitation of minors very early, because already in the 3rd century, in the tradition, we see the appearance, the rise of a new word, in Greek, paidophthoreo, which means the sexual abuse of children in the meaning of corruption, which is it's a term that you don't find in classical Greek. Because in classical Greek there is sexual use of children, but not as a negative. It's a neutral. And so early Christians know that there's something going on in their churches. After that, so after the 3rd century, it's very hard to find an objective, accurate dealing with that phenomenon. So here there is an interruption in the Catholic tradition dealing with this problem, a silence. And that silence now, it's over, and we have to be honest that in the Catholic tradition, there is a problem at some point on that issue, especially that issue, and then others. A third problem is how we look at the liturgy and sacramental theology. So here, there's no question, as I said, that every serious study knows that the sexual abuse of children happens in every institution that deals with the youth, religious and secular. Australia, the UK, they have conducted studies. It's a very similar pattern. What is the difference for religion and Christianity and Catholicism especially? It's the theology of the priesthood. So the identification between the priest and the person of Christ, in persona Christi. And so experts say that victims felt abuse just one stage of separation from God. It's not something that you can find easily in a Boy Scout master. It's different. And second is the fact that many of these abuses happen in church buildings, in churches sometimes near the altar. So there is a black sacramentality of the abuse. It's a perversion of a certain depth and richness of the Catholic stuffiness. I mean, Catholics have a lot of stuff, things, objects, do things, perform, smells, touch, and all that. That's why, so there is a very heavy Catholic import on the abuse crisis. So what does that mean for the young generation of Catholics that approach the liturgy, who know that, who have heard of that, or that smell that very different sense of relationship that there is between the community and the priest? This is a really serious problem because all this crisis doesn't happen in a vacuum, but happens in the context of a very unstable theological, magisterial narrative on the liturgical reform of the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council changed a few things of the liturgy. In the vernacular, the priest facing the congregation, and so on. Especially in the United States, in these last few years, there has been a movement saying the liturgical reform was bad because it made that look more Protestant, it took away the solemnity, all that stuff, which I don't buy, not even for a minute, but that's what happened. What has been the response of some to the abuse crisis is to say, well, of course the abuse crisis happened because we have desacralized the priesthood. So what is the recipe? Let's resacralize. So let's isolate priesthood even more, which is what many experts say was one of the causes of the abuse crisis. So here, the abuse crisis opens the question of what we make of the effects of the liturgical reform on the causes of the abuse crisis. Was the abuse crisis one of the effects of the failure of the liturgical reform? It's a big question. So there are many things that are being moved on the chessboard of the Catholic Church by the abuse crisis. Fourth, what the abuse crisis means for a theological idea of reform. This is one of the most Catholic idea that you can get. And so things don't change, they are reformed. Now, the abuse crisis shakes many assumptions of the theology of church reform in the last century. One of them is that the Catholic Church got rid of the abuses and of corruption in the Counter-Reformation. 16th, 17th century, now our problem is to modernize. Well, we discovered that there's a problem of abuses and corruption going on. It's not just a problem of modernizing. Second, the thrust of reform in Catholicism in this last century was, let's give more power to the bishops. And I leave that with no comments, because you all know how a disaster that has been. Third was the idea that the reform of the church was to be done in a climate of communion and trust, where everyone could win. No, there's an element of conflict in the reform of the Catholic Church that I believe Pope Francis has made very clear. You cannot reform the church without conflict, which also can be violent, verbally, at least. That is fourth, that the reform can happen in the Catholic Church with more lay involvement, lay people. The problem is that the theology of the lay people at the Second Vatican Council is not a Vatican II theology, it's a 1940, 1950 theology. We now know that being a lay person in the Catholic Church means basically nothing other than I'm not a priest. All the rest, we don't know what that means. Because if you are a lay Catholic who owns a TV channel or is a billionaire, you are worth 10 or 15 cardinals. It means nothing to be lay people. More lay people means reform. In some cases, that means the opposite. Finally, there's one last issue that I will touch more extensively tonight, which is this. The sexual abuse crisis is an extremely powerful and also insidious element of disruption in the relationship between church and state, church and governments, church and politics. If we see the state arresting bishops, cardinals, it's a good sign, I think, because it means that there's still some sense of what the rule of law is, that no one is above the law. At the same time, it means that the boundaries church and state are no longer holding. I'll give you one example before I finish, and I leave some time for questions. When Cardinal Pell of Australia was arrested last year, I was teaching a graduate course at Villanova, and in my class there were a few students coming from a non-Western, non-European country where the church has been persecuted for many years, and it's still persecuted in some sense. And these students belong to a religious order. And they told me with some embarrassment, we received from our religious order the invitation to pray for Cardinal Pell because his conviction is the product of the Australian conspiracy to persecute the Catholic Church in Australia, which is a narrative that very few people will buy in Australia and in the Western world. So this crisis is a symptom that there are massive tectonic movements in where the Catholic Church is on the world map, and our assumption that there is a church with its jurisdiction, its autonomy, and the state that respects that autonomy is very much in doubt. That has good consequences because, again, rule of law means that the priesthood is not supposed to be immune from jurisdiction, but at the same time, this could be looked at in the context of a growing pressure on the churches and on the Catholic Church in some countries. And that's one of the reasons why the Vatican, I believe, is reluctant to legislate on an automatic mandate to report to secular authorities in every country. Those exist in some individual countries, but not globally, because this is a very complicated situation in some countries. So I would stop here because I'm very curious to hear if you have questions or comments or suggestions. So I'll stop here. Thank you for your patience.